how's everyone doing? This is going to be the first project we make using diagram. And this is going to assume that you have some understanding of Unity and you know what a game object is, because if you downloaded this package and put this package into your scene, you'll see that we have a scene already set up here. And the scene we have set up in this, and the way I got to this scene, if you haven't loaded it up yet, if you were from a new scene, I went down to Scenes, and I clicked on PH1. This is your project folder, Scenes, PH101. If I click that, I don't actually want to do that, but that's how you'll load up the scene. And if you look, you should see something like this. What this is this is the first level of a PlayStation 4 game and a Steam game called Rallycopters that was made by a company called Depth First Games, and they graciously let us use these assets to show you how to use this program diagram to get functionality to get this game working. So you're basically going to be programming all of the same things that make this game work the same way that it was programmed for the PlayStation 4 and Steam game. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same. For the interest of time, we're going to be cutting down on some of the things, but you're going to get most of the functionality for it. If I hit play right now, you'll see that I can't really do anything. This guy's animating because the animator's already starting on it, but I can't do anything yet. There's no functionality to this game. There's just these assets that we put in the world that are sitting here. So normally you would have to use scripting to get functionality to make this working, but we're going to use visual scripting, and we're going to use diagram to do some visual scripting for this. So the first thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to move the helicopter, do a simple move for the helicopter so we can start moving around this space. And to do that, you'll see that in my hierarchy right here, here are all the objects that are in the world. As I select them, you can see that kind of selecting the things that are in here. The camera, the helicopter. If I select the helicopter, you'll see that's there. These warnings are here because there were shaders that were made in this that are not in this package. I can clear them. They might come back up. But the first thing I want to do is deal with the helicopter. And so I selected the helicopter right here. And you can see that it's selected. To do this, this helicopter is actually what's called a prefab. And a prefab is kind of a way to copy things in Unity. And they're all down in this folder called prefabs right here. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to actually work on the prefab instead of working on this instance of the prefab right here, so that if I ever made another helicopter, it would just be just like this one. So this helicopter Heli 3 is an instance of this prefab right here, and I'm going to click on Heli 3 prefab, which is not in the scene. It's if I drug any more of these in, you would see more of them, but it will, whatever I do to this is going to go to the instance of this. So how do we get this working, and how do we add functionality to this using visual scripting and diagram visual scripting? Well, all of these things are components, and if I were going to add a script to this, you would see that I can add a component right here. And I'm going to add a component. Instead of script, I'm going to scroll down and go to virtual hammer, diagram behavior. So this diagram behavior is the component that allows us to start scripting for this in visual scripting. I'm going to click editor, click this button right here, and it's going to bring me to an editor that will allow me to start adding functionality to this. And as I bring it up, the first thing you see is this start event right here. Start happens once when the object comes alive. I can add more events. If you're used to Unity, these should be very familiar to you. I can add more events by clicking this plus right here. And the event I want, these are all a bunch of Unity events that Unity calls they happen. The event I want is update. I'm going to add an update event. And I get a new tab. And update as start is called once when this thing comes to life. Update's called all the time, every frame per second that this is going to go. So this is how you add functions that would be in Unity, or events that would be in Unity. If I wanted to add a fixed update, which I'm going to use also, I could add a fixed update here. And you'll see that the events also come down here. I can hide them if I need to hide them. If I have a bunch a lot of events coming up here. I need to hide some of them. Like I'm not going to be using start right now, so I can hide it, click that V, it will make it not visible anymore. So I'll just do that. And what we want to do with this helicopter here is I want to move this helicopter based on the player's input. So the first thing I'm going to have to do, and I'm going to click back on that, I'm going to go to the diagram here. And based on the player's input, the player can press the input whenever he wants. So that's something that's going to go into update. Whenever the when of this is whenever the player hits input, I want to be able to capture that input. So I'm going to capture it in a variable. And to create variables, what I'm going to do is right here, this tab right here is kind of your menu tab. I can open that and close that by clicking that little arrow button right there. And I'm going to click this plus by the variables and add a variable to this. And the type of variable I want to contain this input in is a float. And a float is a decimal number because the input's going to come in a decimal number. And I'm going to call this V input for vertical input. And I need another one for horizontal input. V input, vertical input, is going to deal with W and S because that's the way Unity has it set up. And horizontal input, I'll make another float here. Hit create that, go down to float. I'm going to call this H input for horizontal input. Hit create. So I have H input and V input, and I want to store the input values into these. You can see there's 0 right now, but as this runs, as update runs, and I call these functions to get that, it will start storing that into here. So let's do that right now. What I want to do is I want to get the input for this. So to get access to the Unity functions, I right-click in here, and you'll see this context menu come up. And this context menu is going to give me access to all the things I can do in Unity. If you see, I can scroll down here. And that's pretty imposing to see all the things that I can do, but I can use this search menu to get exactly what I want. So if I'm looking for input, if I type in input, you'll see that the input comes in here, and I can see all the things I want with input. The one I'm looking for is actually get access. And if I really knew that before I came into input, I could just type in get access. And it will search for that. I want get access, not get access raw. And get access is going to give me one of the access of that Unity saves in its input manager. So if I go to edit, project settings, input manager, and under access, you'll see that here are all the access that it has predefined for us. You can make your own, but for right now we're going to use the predefined ones. Here's horizontal, and there's vertical. And you can see that the positive button right here is D. That would be D on the keyboard, and the negative button, Alt negative and Alt positive. Left and right arrows and A and D are going to give me my positive and negatives here for this. So I'm going to click back on Heli, and it's the same with vertical. Vertical does W and S the same way. So I'm going to assign vertical here first. And I get the name vertical from the axis that was actually here in project settings input. This is the name. Vertical is the name of the axis here. And so whenever I press W and S, it's going to give me a value of -1 to 1. This function is, and I'm going to store that by dragging off of here into my V input. And you can see that I kind of stepped ahead of myself. This is how we connect the logic to make this stuff work. Update's going to get called all the time, and I want it to call this all the time. So I connect the logic from these execution tabs into the next thing I want it to do. And when this happens, I want this to fill in this variable. So I'm going to go to the next execution tab. Now this V input variable is going to be filled in by what comes out of this function, which is -1 to 1. And I'm going to do the same thing. I can actually I can copy paste this. Control C, Control V. And instead of vertical, I can put in horizontal. Now if I don't spell that correctly, like I did right there, horizontal, it's horizontal. If I don't spell it correctly, it's not going to work. So while visual scripting tries to limit the amount of typing you're going to have to do and the amount of syntax you're going to have to understand. There are still some things you're going to have to type correctly to get the right things. And I want to store this one in H input. So if I drag off of here, I can go to H input and then set that one up. So now in update, all the time, whenever this runs, it's going to fill in values for H input and V input and H input. And what I want to do with that is I need to move my helicopter around. And I'm going to move my helicopter using physics. I have a rigid body component on here, and rigid body adds physics to an object, simulated physics to an object in the world. And I'm going to do that with this helicopter right here. I'm going to simulate pushing it around with physics because the rigid body is going to allow me to do that. So I need access to talk to this rigid body, and to do that I need a variable so I can get this rigid body component that I can talk to it in here. So I'm going to make another variable, and this type I'm going to make is of rigid body. So if I just typed in rigid, and you'll see that rigid body is the type of variable I can make here. That's the one I want, and I'm going to call this, I'm going to name it heli RB is fine. I can make more than one variable at a time. Like, I know I'm going to need another variable of type float. If I just click plus here while I have this open, I can make a float variable. And I know I'm going to need a variable called speed because I want to dictate how fast this thing goes. And if I create this, you'll see it'll create two new variables over here. I'm going to fill in this myself with 200. I can type that in because it's a simple variable. But this is a component, so you'll see right now that it says none. This is just a variable container. It doesn't have any value associated to it yet, as it says none. So I have to fill this in. And I actually want the helicopter's rigid body, and since I have the helicopter selected, this is the rigid body for it. I can simply click on this and drag it up into there. And you'll see that this is now the Heli 03 rigid body. So this is what's going to deal with the physics associated with this. So now that I have the input captured, I need to tell the rigid body how I want this to start moving. And I need to add force to this. And I already created a fixed update event here. I did that by adding base events and adding a fixed update event. And I'm going to click on it. And there's nothing in here. So in fixed updates, nothing happening. But I want to make this rigid body get a force added to it based on our input. So I can add variables to this in two ways. I can right click under variables right here. I can find the one I want and add it, or I can delete that. I can add it right here in this little node, add to graph, and add that. And so, as I mentioned before, what I want to do with this is add force. So I'm going to drag off of this in context sensitive. You'll see that all the rigid body stuff comes up here. And I want to add force. So it's right there. I could search for it too. Add force. And there's a couple of them, but I want this one. Add force. Now remember that nothing will happen to this unless I connect it with the executions. So I'm connecting the execution. And this is going to add, at this point, this will add a force of 0 to this. But I don't want it to add a force of 0. I want it to add the force based on the input and the speed of the helicopter. So to do that, I have to add values to the x and the y on what direction I want it to go in. So I never want this to go on the z, because our game, if you look at this, this is the x-axis is right and left, and the y-axis is up and down. Z is in and out of the screen. And since this is a 2D game, I never want it to go in the z, so I don't want to make a vector that does this. So I have to make a vector that has the values I want. So I'm going to drag off of this, and to make custom variables and assign them, we call it assign. So I'm going to type in assign, and you'll see assign vector 3. And this basically breaks this vector up into x, y, and z that I can assign right here. So to do that, what values do I want here? Well, I have to tell it to go left and right, and that's going to come from the H input, -1 to 1, which could be 0 also if I'm not pressing any button. And I want it to go up and down, and that's going to come from the V input, but I want it to go at the speed that I want the helicopter to go at. So off of this, I need to multiply these two together based on the X and the Z. So I'm going to right click, go to variables, go to H input, which is left and right, which assigns to the X, but this is just -1 to 1, which isn't fast enough. So I need to multiply that. I can drag off that. I can type mult, or I can just do the time sign, and you'll see multiply float. There's a little times there. And I want to multiply it by speed. So I'm going to come off this and go to speed. And that is the total value, force I want to do that. -200, 0, or +200 is going to come in here based if I'm pressing A or D. And I need to do the same thing. I can actually just copy all this, select it, and just hold, drag, and select it all. Control C, Control V. And it's the same thing, except here, I want this to be V input. Now I could delete that, or I could reassign this variable. I just want to reassign it to V input times speed, and that goes into the Y. And I don't want any force on my Z because I don't want this going in and out of the screen because it's a 2D game. So in update of the helicopter, I get the input from Unity, the vertical input, hold that in a variable, get the input for the horizontal input, hold that in a variable, and then over in fixed update, I say Rigidbody, which I get access to. I want to add a force to you, and that force I want to add is whatever my input was coming in, A and D, times speed, do that to your X, left and right. Whatever my W and S is, times speed, do that to my Y. And I should see that now I can move my helicopter around, and it's basically adding a force to that if I'm hitting W, S, A, and D to move this around. So this is very simple movement. You can see that the helicopter's not, it's not facing the correct direction. It's not like tilting. It's not doing any of the fancy stuff yet. And the camera's not following it around. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how to make it a little bit fancier and look like it's moving a bit better and make the camera move it. But let's go over what we learned right now. On this prefab right here using diagram, and if I click on this helicopter right here, you can see that since I did it on the prefab, it knows to make the instances in the scene also do it. So they actually copy whatever I did in the prefab. What we learned is we learned how to create these events that Unity has. I'll put my start back up there so you can see it by clicking V. But there's the start function, the update function, and fixed update. Those should be familiar to people familiar with Unity, but these are things that Unity will call to allow us to get functionality going. And we learned how to make a variable and how to use the context menu to find functionality that we want. And we learned how to create variables, these are simple variables that we can assign right here, create more complex variables like components that we can assign by dragging them in. And then we used functions to manipulate those. These are pre-made functions. We can make our own functions, but that'll be for another video. So simple input to get that helicopter working. The next videos will show you some cooler stuff. So thank you.